All right, should we get started? We've got a good set of folks here. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is Affordable Housing Week San Francisco 2021. And the Council of Community Housing Organizations has put together a whole set of events throughout the week with folks who we love and work with in Alliance. And tonight we will be presenting a whole conversation about the shelter-in-place hotels and the potential for creating permanent housing. My name is Fernando Martí. Welcome everybody. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Nuala Bishari from San Francisco Public Press.
Hi, I'm Nuala. I'll be moderating the panel this evening. I am a journalist with the San Francisco Public Press and also ProPublica, and I cover homelessness in San Francisco. And I'm really excited about this panel. I think it's a very interesting time in the history of San Francisco in regards to homelessness. And we have some really good speakers here today. So thank you all for being here. I'm just going to go around and let people just say a few sentences about themselves to introduce themselves. Starting with, let's start with Reverend Sadie Stone.
Great, thank you so much. My name is Reverend Sadie Stone. I use she, her pronouns. I am the pastor at Bethany United Methodist Church here in San Francisco, and I am also a leader with Faith in Action, which is a broad-based of community congregations, schools, community organizations that does broad-based community organizings and advocates for those who are closest to the pain, doing a lot of social justice and community organizing work here in San Francisco. So it's great to be with everyone tonight.
Okay, Jenny Friedenbach, do you want to go next?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Jennifer Friedenbach, and I'm the director of the Coalition on Homelessness here in San Francisco. And I use she, her pronouns, and really excited to be here.
Okay, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm a Gemini, she, her, and I work with Community Housing Partnership, and we're a supportive housing provider. We have about 17 buildings. Most of them are in the Tenderloin area, but we do go throughout the city. And I'm the director of policy and organizing. So thanks, glad to see everyone.
Okay, and last but not least, Ryan.
Hi, I'm Ryan Williams, and I am staying in one of the SIP hotels right now. I'm staying at Site 10, which is the Wickham.
Great. Wonderful, thank you. And I use she, her pronouns, just to add that in. So let's just start with a little bit of background. For those who aren't familiar, the SIP hotels, which we call them as a nickname, the shelter-in-place hotels, were started shortly after the pandemic hit in 2020. So the city started leasing hotels that were closed due to a drop in tourism and moving people experiencing homelessness off the streets and into rooms. For the most part, these were people who were particularly vulnerable if they contracted COVID. So that included people with diabetes, asthma, seniors, and so on. And all told, over 2,000 hotel rooms were filled. Over the subsequent months, advocates and the Board of Supervisors called on the mayor's office to expand the program to way more. They wanted about 8,000, I think, rooms to open, but that never happened. The city kept citing concerns over costs, but when Biden was elected, he ordered FEMA to fully reimburse counties for shelter-in-place hotel costs, making the program effectively free or very low cost. So this has been a really remarkable moment in the history of San Francisco's homelessness crisis. Despite the program being smaller than what many people wanted, we've been able to shift thousands of people indoors, even temporarily, and to see what benefits that has to people themselves and also to the situation on our streets. So to go back to the very early days, Reverend, you have some interesting stories about how this program got started. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about how I became involved in it. As I mentioned, I'm the pastor at Bethany United Methodist Church, and there are 9 other United Methodist churches spread throughout our San Francisco city. And our pastors at all of our churches, we were approached by our district superintendent, who's like our leader, our leadership, our boss, sort of, if you're not familiar with the structure of our church, which I'm sure you're not, it's very complicated. And she had been approached by folks in the city or the Interfaith Council asking if we would be willing to open up our churches as additional shelter sites during this pandemic. And this was in March. So right as we're shutting down, if you remember those early days, everybody's locked down, very strict orders. San Francisco lauded, in fact, for our very strict orders in the early days. Also recognizing that in those early days, in those orders, the on-house population was exempt from needing to shelter in place. So there was not a plan in place by the city for those folks. And so we were asked if we would be willing to open up emergency shelter sites in our churches. And typically my church does a lot of work with the unhoused. We work with the San Francisco Night Ministry. We are pro helping the unhoused. But this really felt like a request that we could not fulfill for reasons of safety and concern. One of our tenets in the Methodist Church is to do no harm. And I felt like we would be doing harm if we opened up our churches and created additional mass shelter sites, especially in facilities like our churches that are not set up for them. My church happens to have showers. None of the other 8 churches in the cities that the United Methodist churches have showers. We're just not set up, especially in a pandemic that is spread very quickly. And so what we did instead is our 9 churches came together and we proposed, we knew that there was empty hotel rooms, and we knew that that was a great opportunity to move people indoors. And so to sort of show that it could be done, we donated $100,000 to Hospitality House with Joe Wilson, working with Joe Wilson. And they were able to move everybody from Hospitality House into hotels. And that was really the first housing group and the group of people who were able to move from a congregate shelter site into individual hotel rooms. And it was just an immediate success. In talking with Joe Wilson and the residents there, they felt like they had dignity. They felt like somebody cared about them. It was an immediate indicator that this was really the direction that the city needed to go, and with the resources available to them that churches simply do not have. We were not the solution to try to be that fill gap for this moment in time. And so that's really how I became part of advocating for these shelter in place hotels clear back in March, again, advocating for the full 7,000 to 8,000 that we were hoping for.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, let's shift over to you a little bit to talk about, what the reaction was of the Coalition on Homelessness as the pandemic hit. Obviously, there was a lot of concern for people living outdoors, especially people with physical disabilities who are particularly vulnerable. What was the kind of process like in starting to address the needs of that community in the early days?
Yeah, I think pretty similar to the Methodist Church. They're like, take the hotels, take them. They're empty. So yeah, I mean, we had all this real estate that was empty that wasn't being used. We were super concerned about the shelters, and we did a whole bunch of work with like different medical professionals, and we were gathering constantly a bunch of information and advice in terms of what our policy. We kind of drew on academics, and then of course, like trying as much as we could to engage with unhoused community members. But it was bad out on the streets. I mean, what we kept hearing over and over again is, folks saying, I feel like the city's leaving us here to die. Mm-hmm. At first they were leaving the shelters open, but there was no way to get into shelter. It was just the people who were already there. And which we were like, you can't have these congregate shelters. This is insane. And then there was a massive outbreak in our largest shelter. It's really bad. And they, and then they shifted those folks into hotels, and it was just like this constant struggle. The mayor actually came out and said she wanted 7,000 hotel rooms to begin with. There was also a whole bunch of issues around the hiring, and so we did a bunch of work to try to figure out how to help with that, and all these different things that were coming up. We just tried to kind of problem solve and move from there. So, but really just wanted to amplify seeing a huge transformation. And I think in terms of people being able to have the dignity of a bathroom, of a door to close, of privacy, of moving out of these congregate spaces, some of the folks that were moving from the streets and then other folks from the shelters. And it was just so transformative. And it just kind of, I think, adjusted our thinking, like, we need to completely rethink shelter. Like, we need to rethink everything. And so that's, that reimagining has continued through the whole pandemic.
Perfect, thank you. So Ryan, let's shift over to you. Do you mind sharing your story of how and when you got into a shelter-in-place hotel and what that experience was like?
Sure. I was having some health problems, and so I was at a navigation center. And I was moved from the navigation center to the shelter-in-place site. I believe it was around the end of March of last year. And so since I've been here, it's been a huge transition, a huge change. It's mostly for people who for a lot of their lives had not lived with steady housing, with shelter. I was fortunate enough that I hadn't been put in this sort of a situation. I hadn't had to face this sort of a situation before really in my life. And so it was a real shock getting just initially being in a shelter at all, much less being moved to another one. And yeah, the shock to me was not quite so intense because I'm accustomed to living inside. From what I understand, there were quite a few deaths whenever everyone first moved in, and especially here. And I think that that should be considered as we progress through the whole transitional phase and the living out the remainder of the time in the shelter-in-place hotels. It should be considered that a lot of those who passed away, there were reasons why, I'm sure. But keeping in mind that there are a lot of people who were really taking advantage of the shelter-in-place, and a lot of people still are really taking advantage of the shelter-in-place, the way of thinking that you should try and limit your contact with outside parties, social distancing and all of that, but embracing all of those, but still staying shut up in their rooms, and staying shut up in their rooms. And the depression it's a real thing. I mean, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir. A lot of you have had to have dealt with social distancing, and it can be quite taxing on someone, especially people who are going in from a situation where it was communal. I'm alive. So going from a place that or a way of living where everything was communal, and they could watch out for each other when they were, say, injecting drugs or provide company for one another, they were all of a sudden split up into individual rooms. And in the beginning, there was it was allowed that people go from room to room to I get some human interaction, but apparently there was a problem with that, and so they changed the policy, an unwritten change, but they changed the policy so that now you are not allowed to go from room to room, which the city and county came through asking questions probably about a month after I moved in here. And they were asking, do you think it would help you with, with being lonely and such? Do you think it would help you if you had a buddy system? Or is there another way that we can organize something like that? Because they were saying that I wasn't the only one. And of course, I'm not the only one who can get depressed when being put in close quarters for quite some time. But I was surprised that they discontinued that they changed that.
Mm.
Especially now, I feel as though that policy should be reassessed, because of so many of us having immunizations and such. But I'm getting off on a tangent now. But what else can I tell you about the transition? You were asking about the transition to here, and then how things are going now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for sharing that. It's very helpful to remember that, you know, even though it's there's been a lot of positive outcomes of moving people into shelter-in-place hotels, it is still a pandemic, and it is still a struggle, and isolation is hard. And so I think that's all really important to recognize. Can you talk a little bit about what the experience was like going just from a very congregate setting, you know, when news of the pandemic was coming out? Were you very nervous about catching it, to somewhere that was, you know, I assume quieter, with a little bit more privacy, and your own bathroom? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. I wasn't really that concerned with catching it, but that was back in the beginning. As time has gone on, I have become more concerned. And then now that I've gotten my immunizations, or the vaccine, I'm sorry. Now that I have that, I'm not really concerned at all about. I mean, I still watch the surfaces that I touch when I'm in communal areas, but as far as in the beginning, no, I really wasn't incredibly worried about contracting it. But I was in a setting where we were passing around germs. I mean, like crazy. We were sleeping in rooms, like large rooms without dividers, or without dividers in every place where they might have been, to prevent the spread of certain contractable diseases. Yeah, I was going to, but anyway, yes, to round it off, I then also had a family member who passed away from COVID, and so that opened my eyes to it as well. But no, in the beginning, I don't think a lot of the people out on the streets really were concerned with contracting it. I think that this has been a great opportunity for them, of course. And I could speak on that forever. But the other people, they weren't watching sensationalized news every day or 24 hours a day. They weren't caught up on current events necessarily. They were living on the streets, so without access to a lot of technology, some of them without even cell phones, where they could read the news, you know. That way of life, though, made it so that they were highly at risk, except that they were getting to build up their immune systems while everyone else we were unaware, getting shocked by it, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan.
You're welcome.
Jennifer, can we talk a little bit about, you know, some of the people that you saw move indoors? I know that you have some relationships and friendships and connections with people who've been living outdoors for a long time. Are there any stories that come to mind about people who moved indoors and what that experience was like to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's thinking about one person going back, not going to name any names, but going back a long time, who used to be active with the organization and had just, you know, was out there with his boyfriend for a long time. And there was like some degree of hope. It's a certain point where they got into housing, and then, you know, him and his boyfriend broke up. And then just over time, I just saw just this lack of hope, and really feeling like they'd never ever have a situation that would change, and it wouldn't really be worth even trying because their heart would get broken. I mean, it was a series of having the rug pulled out from underneath them so many times. And so yeah, I mean, I saw him go indoors, and just like his face, like just like how his face changed in terms of how he looks, was so different in terms of, you know, he has a lot of, you know, a lot of kind of like outbursts publicly and stuff like that. And he was just so much calmer and so much better. And he told me, you know, Jenny, I knew I never thought I'd do this, but I finally, I gave it a try and it's all right. It's all right. So, you know, and I mean, of course, if he had decent offers before, he would have taken them. But, you know, you have to tell yourself after a while that you're choosing to be where you are, because the truth of living in a situation where you don't have choices is so overwhelming for folks. So you sort of just, you know, have this attitude, this is where I want to be with, you know, but finally the reality was he was actually offered something. You know, and I've probably known him for about almost 30 years, honestly. So of him being homeless this entire time.
Yeah.
So yeah, and he's younger than me. I mean, he was a kid when I first met him. Yeah, I was a kid too, but yeah. So yeah.
Great, thank you. So, you know, the shelter in place program is going to be wrapping up later this year, presumably. I know that the original deadline for the FEMA funding runs out in September, unless that's changed. So there's the big question of where people are going to go from the shelter in place hotels. And can someone, let's move to Sarah. Can you explain the difference between temporary shelter in the shelter in place hotels and permanent supportive housing? What is permanent supportive housing?
I didn't know there'd be a test today. Permanent supportive housing is, well, just as it sounds, but it's a type of affordable housing where people can, you know, stay there forever if that's what they need because of their incomes. And there are support services. So sort of like social services built into the properties so that there's staff on site who provides things like case management, counseling, resource and referral, and that kind of stuff. And a lot of the residents who are moved into the SIP hotels started to experience that same kind of model because there were a lot of different providers brought into the SIP hotels. So it's different to some extent than other types of housing and or than some of the shelters. There's an intensive, you know, kind of focus on services in the SIP hotels, just the way similarly there is in permanent supportive housing. And so where people go, the question of where people go from the SIP hotels has everything to do with an assessment that, you know, that the city does in terms of their needs. And that's a whole big thing. I don't know how much we want to get into it. It's called coordinated entry. Some of you know about it. But only a certain percentage of the folks in the SIP hotels have been found to be essentially eligible for the permanent supportive housing. So it's not an automatic ticket from the SIP hotels into that type of housing, but I would argue that it basically should be, that anybody who's found themselves in one of these SIP hotels probably needs at least the permanent affordable part of it, maybe not the services unnecessarily, but unfortunately, that's not the city's view, and they are, you know, placing a number of people in alternative types of housing that we have real questions about whether they're really appropriate and whether they're really going to meet people's needs and whether they're really going to, you know, be long-term solutions.
I have a question for you, if you don't mind. What is the cost of permanent supportive housing? You said permanent affordable housing, I think maybe once or twice. What is the cost to the residents?
For the most part, 30% of their income, it's income based. There's a few outliers right now that we're trying to deal with. But yeah, generally speaking, it's 30% of one's income.
Okay, so there will be people moving from the hotel settings, from the SIP settings into permanent supportive housing, and they'll have, it will negatively impact their ability to their cash flow,
You're absolutely right that people have, especially if they've been in a SIP hotel for a year now or whatever, they've been basically getting housing for free, and they will be then expected to pay rent, and that can be an issue for sure.
Yeah, and just to add the little bit of nuance on that, there are people who are on welfare getting county adult assistance or GA that are having their checks deducted. So some people in the SIP hotels are paying rent, others are not. And for those folks who are paying rent, I mean, the other thing that's kind of interesting about this whole thing of the SIP hotels is that it's private, but it's not run like housing. And so it's run with a lot of rules, you know? And so Ryan was mentioning the whole not being able to visit each other. Some of the hotels are run with curfews. Many of them have security and they have wands. There's a lot of kind of knocking on the door. Sometimes people entering the rooms. There's just like a lot. It's run in a lot more intensive way. So when when folks are moving over to permanent supportive housing, that's going to be their unit. They're going to have tenant rights. There's not going to be that level of micromanaging of their lives. It's going to be their own place. And so, you know, some of the supportive housing have front desks and have rules around guests in terms of limits, like you could have so many and that kind of thing, sleepovers, but it kind of varies from site to site. But generally speaking, it's going to be, you know, people's own place and not kind of this quasi-shelter type situation.
Great. So let's move on to talking about supply a little bit, because as everyone knows, San Francisco is always kind of perpetually in a housing crisis. And I think especially when it comes to permanent supportive housing, there just isn't enough for everybody who's living outdoors and everybody who's living in the shelter-in-place hotels. So Sarah, I don't know if you have an exact number. I think the last number I looked up for the number of units of permanent supportive housing was 7,499, I think, in the city. So, you know, looking at how to increase the supply of those units, in the past year, thanks to some state funding, the city purchased 2 large hotels, the Diva and the Granada, which added more than 300 units of permanent supportive housing to the city's portfolio, which is great. But when you think about how many people are still living outdoors, you know, 300 units does not go very far. And over the past year, as tourism has struggled and, you know, the city is trying to figure out how to house more people experiencing homelessness, there was a list that came in of hotel owners who were willing to consider selling their hotels to the city. And Jenny, I think you're the one who told me about this originally, but there were 70 hotels on that list, and it may have grown since then. And so you think about the fact that we had 2 hotels bought in the last year that were deemed incredibly successful. If we had the money, how many more could we buy? So Jenny, I'm going to shift over to you to talk a little bit about funding, particularly Prop C, which I know so many people voted for when it was on the ballot, but very few people are aware of where we are in that process and if that money can be used, for example, to buy permanent supportive housing. So can you give us a little bit of a rundown of the funding and finances and where we could get some money to buy more hotels?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got, I mean, this is I just want to start by saying it's a super exciting moment that we're in right now, because we have some different things that are happening. First of all, we have Prop C, which was about an average of 0.5% tax on corporate income over 50 million that Coalition on Homelessness, in collaboration with other organizations and individuals, put on the ballot. And then it was held up in court. So it passed in 2018, it was held up in court. And then in the fall, we ended up prevailing in the legal fight as well. So the funds were ready for release. And there's now been 2, there was an initial release and then the second investment plan that came out. And but we want to have Prop C money, which is going to be ongoing, about 300 million a year, every year. leveraged with other kinds of funds, because even though it seems like a lot, 300 million, if you're talking about new units, it doesn't get you that far, given, what's going on here. And so the typical hotel, we're talking about, in terms of costs, we're talking about $400K per door with rehab. Ideally, bathrooms and kitchenettes in suites so that we can transform them into studios, and that's doable for that amount of money. And the beautiful thing is that it's also available very quickly, instead of like a new construction, which you're saying is like $700K per door, and then you're waiting all these years to make it happen. So it's like this really incredible opportunity that I know for myself, doing this work for this long, I never dreamed of, like purchasing hotels, like, and turning them into studios. Like, that's amazing. So in the Prop C investment plan, for acquisitions, it has funding for acquisitions for about 177 adult acquisitions, because we broke it up so you had to do youth and families as well, because those populations are frequently ignored. Enough money for 225 youth acquisitions, these are doors, so like per studios, and then 188 families, which would be larger units, of course, and higher than the 400K cost. But we have operating monies for more than that. And so, in terms of operating, we're talking about like 350 units for adults, and about 250 for families, and 225 for youth. And so we're trying to get the city to then use additional money for more acquisitions. So there's a bunch of possibilities. We've got Homekey. So I don't know if you guys saw the news, but another bit of exciting news. I mean, it's just like, I mean, we're talking about a generational opportunity to move the dial on homelessness that we haven't seen. And so the state is coming down with all this money for Homekey. They pay about half, so like 200K per unit. And they pay for about a couple years of operating. The operating costs are about 20K per person in terms of both social support services and kind of upkeep of the building and stuff. And so those, that's how that's budgeted. It's a little more than that, but yeah. And so basically, if we're able to utilize, so the different things is we have the American Rescue Act, which has a whole bunch of general monies in it. There's monies for home. We've got the Homekey from the state. We've got AB 71 that's possibly passing. We have also FEMA. We're going to only, like was mentioned earlier, they were going to pay for 75%. So we budgeted 25% of the SIP hotels and a lot of the other efforts. And now they're reimbursing all the way back to January 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. So all that money we planned on using for homeless people, our position is that money should be reallocated for acquisitions. We're talking about being able to do 1,000 units on top of those units that I just mentioned that are going to be done, that are going to be paid for in the investment plans with Prop C. I also want to do a bigger picture thing. So the Prop C investment plan, we've got not just acquisitions, we also have subsidies that people can use in the private market. And those are kind of like Section A, they call them flex pool, they call them scattered site, there's different names for them, but same concept. You pay 30% of your income, you use a private landlord, so there's more like geographic diversity, and then it comes with support services. So we're also investing in a bunch of those. So if you add all of that together in terms of the housing and include the Granada and the Diva and the stuff that we've done this year during the pandemic, we're talking about hitting the 4,000 mark of getting people off the streets. So that is incredible. I mean, we don't want to oversell it. Over 20,000 people experienced homelessness in San Francisco last year, coming in and out of homelessness. But this is a huge, huge opportunity to move the dial. That's just with the Prop C investment. So if we leverage that and go much farther, we can really see a very serious reduction in homelessness.
Incredible. Thank you so much. There is so much there, but I appreciate so much all of the creativity and energy that goes into identifying these sources and really putting pressure on governments to properly leverage things. Sarah, I want to go back to you to talk a little bit about permanent supportive housing as it is right now. I know that a lot of it is lumped into just a couple geographic areas. Can you tell me a little bit about, what our current permanent supportive housing portfolio looks like, and kind of the range of differences that exist between buildings and units.
Yeah, permanent supportive housing in San Francisco tends to be for single adults. We don't have a lot that it actually serves families, even necessarily couples, because they tend to be very small units. Frequently SRO, which is single resident occupancy, and or residential hotels. And so we have a pretty limited stock when we talk about permanent supportive housing, although developers across the city are creating, more and more that are actually maybe family serving or larger units and such. So some of the new stock, we're seeing that. And because of that, and this has to do with the affordability, it's that simple as to why we have so many of the type of housing for our very lowest income residents at tiny sizes and in neighborhoods that are lowest cost. So that they tend to be, the Tenderloin, South of Market, Central City in general, some Mission, that kind of thing. We certainly don't see a lot of permanent supportive housing, out in Pacific Heights, right? So it does create a problem, both in terms of, the limited options we're offering people when we say, and it's amazing thing when somebody actually gets offered a PSH unit and the city is able, in the case of SIP hotel residents, to provide some of this to people, but it's like your options are usually an SRO room in the Tenderloin, and I'm not personally knocking that. I work for a community housing partnership. We provide a lot of SRO units in the Tenderloin, but it is a very specific thing. And then obviously it leaves out more, families and youth, and people that have special needs of certain sorts. So one of the things, as we push, the campaign Jenny was talking about, pushing the city to purchase these hotels while we have this like historic moment, is also pushing them to think more broadly about creative options for housing, and to be able to provide permanent supportive housing, have all those things that people need, but also to meet the range of needs and to consider the dignity, of folks coming in from off the streets, who just like you or I don't want to share a bathroom, don't want to be restricted by, say, visitor policies and things like that, which happens in SROs. And certainly people who are in recovery, being in a place like the Tenderloin can be a real problem. Other people also, they want to be more in their communities where they came from. They may want to be with closer to their people that they know, over in the Bayview, for instance, and not, in South of Market somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. It's been interesting in our conversation, some of our conversations recently with the city, as we try to push them on this, that I think they're finally getting it, and they're starting to, actually include in their criteria looking for properties that have bathrooms, for instance, properties where people don't have to share kitchens, and they're looking at geographic diversity too. That we met with them recently, and they mentioned all of those things in terms of kind of their list, that was promising. But this big sort of deal was made of, mostly in the media, I think some city officials too, about the Granada Hotel, which was one of the first ones that was actually purchased with Episcopal Community Services to house people from SIP hotels. And it was this narrative about how, oh, people wouldn't take the unit, you know, these people, they're these ungrateful people, and, you know, oh, supposedly they're so desperate, but they're saying no to these units. Come on, what's going on? You know, real conservative argument was made about this. And but those of us, you know, who've been watching this and you know, working with homeless folks, it's like, or just who can have a little bit of sense about what we ourselves would want. You know, we understood that, you know, sometimes a tent on the sidewalk is better than it being indoors if it gives you a little more privacy and freedom, and, you know, things like that are super important to people. Or again, if you're in recovery and you need to be, you know, away from what's going on right on the corner.
Mm-hmm.
People, this has been an important kind of conversation within this advocacy effort, is kind of the issue of people's self-determination and dignity and, you know, all of that stuff. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really important, and we do have this opportunity to really talk to people and figure out what they want. You know, so for example, I live in the Haight. There are, as far as I'm aware, no permanent supportive housing units in this neighborhood, and it's a really tricky thing for people whose community is here to think about moving down to the Tenderloin, especially if they're a young person and don't have their friends there. Moving on to you, Reverend, was there anything you wanted to add in regards to this? Any concerns from your constituents about kind of the issue of dignity and what, I feel like amenities is too broad of a statement, but, you know, what sorts of things they would like to have in housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things that Sarah already sort of addressed is this idea that people need to look at folks who are unhoused or who are poor as people who have opinions and rights and a right to self-determination, that it's not just they get what they get and they don't throw a fit, right? That whole idea that we do with like toddlers or whatever, that they have a right to a basic decency and good accommodations, and that we really as a city and a country need to reshift the way that we talk about people. We have criminalized being poor in this country. We have criminalized not having access to certain things. And in that, we've been able to hold this hierarchy of who deserves certain things. And housing is a human right. Basic decency is a human right. Access to medical care, all of, and housing is a basic tenet of this, right? When you put someone in housing and you give them human decency and you give them access to their own bathroom and privacy, it allows them to heal their body. It allows them to heal their soul. It allows them to renew themselves as being someone who matters in this world. And I think those things can't be overlooked or overstated. And that's really what we heard when we first moved folks from the shelter, hospitality house into the hotels, is they were like, it's amazing to us that someone cared about us, that someone saw us and worried about us and recognized us as people who deserved something better. And so a lot of my work in advocacy is just wanting to reshift the narrative about how we talk about folks who are on the street and how we treat folks who are on the streets, and really just wanting to shift that whole narrative, not only in our city, but the whole country. I mean, we've just really done a disservice, and it really allows people to wash their hands of this. It allows our government systems to wash their hands of this as something people don't deserve, or they've chosen this. And, you know, it really just, bathrooms, something as simple as a bathroom. I mean, I think about how important that is to me, to have access to a bathroom, and everyone needs that same right and that same opportunity. And so if we're not offering people good options, I can't bemoan them for not taking them, right? Like they're people. So
Thank you. So we have another little over 10 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to questions. So if you have any questions that have arisen during this conversation, feel free to put them in the chat and we will address them starting at 7 o'clock. So Ryan, I wanted to offer you another chance to speak. I don't know how you're feeling about the shelter-in-place hotel program winding down, and if you've thought at all about what you would want after this, or if you've been offered anything, if you want to share anything along those lines. Oh, and you're muted, just hit unmute.
Thank you. Okay. So your question was about
what's next? once the program ends, have you thought about, you know, what steps you're interested in, or have you been offered any sort of housing at this point?
Yes, they offered me a unit. I have an ADA request put in for a private bathroom and a place to prepare meals. And it's, luckily my doctor was kind enough to write it, and I say kind enough. It was something that was really, it's necessary. And I know that sounds like I'm setting myself apart from the other people who it might not be necessary for, but as the Reverend was saying, it's important that everyone have what they need, that everyone have the access to their basic needs. And I have health conditions that make it so that it's necessary. Moving on from here, I would, based on the timeline that I was given in the last webinar that I was in on this topic, it looks like we could be here until August or September. I mean, that's fine. The accommodations here are it's a nice place to stay. It's free. There are 3 meals a day delivered to my door. As far as being in a place where I could make some transitional changes in my own life and meet some really big goals in my regarding my health. It's been a godsend being able to stay here and take care of myself and get the rest that I needed and recover some. It's nearly priceless, I would have to say. And for some people, if I could explain to you some of the people who I'm in here with and what a wonderful impact it's had on their lives, having access to a telephone that they can use, a telephone that you can use where you can have a private conversation. Like you could even call about your credit card or something, because some of these people have been in situations where they're around people all of the time, no matter what. And so access to that, access to the news, access to the internet, and then all of the other amenities that are here, having an on-site clinic, where even if your provider doesn't work with this clinic, your provider can come see you here in the clinic here. Yeah, I mean, the amenities are wonderful. So I'm not in a huge rush to move into another unit. I mean, I'll be happy when I have a kitchen. That'll be nice, but I'm making do with what I have, and like I said, again, it's free too.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Just to wrap up our preset questions before we get to everyone else's questions, looking ahead, and this maybe is a question for Jenny, how can we advocate for the acquisition of permanent supportive housing? You know, just as lay people who are maybe not involved in the super nitty gritty of finances, or who are not super familiar with, you know, who's in charge of making these decisions, is there anything that we can be doing to really push the creation of more housing units for people experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if people are associated with organizations, they can start, I mean, you know, putting pressure on the mayor, on the contacts that people have within the administration, doing social media, including it. If you do social media, really, like, you know, now's the time to pump, you know, I mean, there's the information that we've gotten back from the mayor's budget office is they're only interested in doing what Prop C is funding, and they keep saying that over and over again. They're not even mentioning the state grant. I mean, it's just crazy. And so we really need to put on the pressure. I think this 1,000 units on top of goal is really good, and people can do that. We do have a group that meets, that's been meeting and talking about it, and we're meeting this Friday at 10 a.m. And basically going to be figuring out what kind of action steps that we can take collectively to put more pressure on the mayor. And so if folks are interested in being added to those meetings, just put your email in the chat, and we will make sure that you get an invite for that meeting. You know, we've got to invent ways to put pressure, right? And get creative and figuring out how to do it during COVID. And really, the only reason they're not doing it is because of political will. So us as people need to put the pressure on. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, when they were putting people in hotels, there was a massive amount of public pressure on the city, and that created the political will to start moving people. Part of that was because of organizing was going on. Part of that was people were like, we actually got to care about homeless people because they might spread the virus, you know? So, so not to be cynical, but it was a mix of things, right? So I think both of those are really important. And just, you know, on all of these things, if there are opportunities to get involved, to just make sure that not only you are doing it, so that you're also asking everyone you know to join in as well. So that, you know, this really is what it takes. It's just all of us really being conscious about pulling other people into the struggle and making it all that more powerful. And yeah.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so now I think let's move on to some questions. There's some really good ones coming in that I'm excited to hear answers to. So I'm just going to let this be more of a free-for-all among our panelists. So if you have an answer, you can just start talking. So Maya raised the question of, are there any disability justice organizing groups involved in advocacy around hotel acquisitions and other housing solutions for unhoused residents? I think that's a really interesting question. I have definitely heard of people, for example, who are in wheelchairs who are offered an SRO unit, you know, on a 7th floor walk up, for example. So I know that ADA is a very big concern for a lot of people. Yeah, I don't know, does anyone have an answer to that? Are there any disability justice organizations involved in the acquisition of permanent support?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but Senior Disability Action is one of the groups that's been involved in our coalition.
Okay.
Yeah, and they've been very active, and also have a bunch of their members that are in the hotels, and there's been a number of different, they've been involved.
Okay. Are there any particular challenges? I mean, I assume, you know, one of those things is elevators, for example. Is it hard to find buildings that have elevators or buildings that have ADA accessible units?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of also, yes, and that's the thing about the tourist hotels is most of them do have elevators, but not, I mean, some of them, the elevators are small, or there's that kind of thing. But of course, disability justice, I mean, it's also all the hidden disabilities that are often not addressed either. And I think that has been an ongoing struggle within the running of the SIP hotels, is making sure that, for example, you know, they're doing offers of housing, and if you turn down more than 3, then you're shit out of luck and they kick you off the list. Well, what if none of them were accessible to you for whatever your disability needs are? What's the appeals process? How are people asserting their rights? And so there's been you know, there's a lot of issues there. Coordinated entry, I would argue, is a system that has built-in inequities, and up until recently, and still is the case in a lot of situations, when people ask for accommodations through that, they're not granted. And so you know, there's a lot of systemic problems with this that that really go back to, I mean, I think the value of self-determination addresses a lot of these things so that people, you know, when they're, you know, talking about what their needs are, their accessibility needs or other needs are, that those are respected and embraced. And part of what's going to take to be successful around this stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, and just I wanted to clarify, if you're unfamiliar with what coordinated entry is, it's the system by which San Francisco determines who is most in need of housing, which is a difficult thing to determine, and in many people's opinions, an unsuccessful model. But it is a method for choosing who gets the very few units that are available out of our very large unhoused population. Let's see what other questions we have. How well is the city doing at moving folks from shelter-in-place hotels into housing? Sarah, you got excited.
Question I wanted to answer.
Okay, good. That's a tough one.
Yeah, I would say not so well. I mean, the point where we like really super jumped into this community housing partnership was when the city revealed their plan for shutting down the SIP hotels, because we read what they were claiming that they would be doing, and knowing what we knew about the agency, which is Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, and sort of their track record and the pace that they work at, and you know, having worked with them as supportive housing providers, we just knew how unrealistic it was. And so we've been trying to sort of monitor and kind of watchdog this process of placing people into housing from the hotels. And along the way, getting the city, and by we, I mean this whole coalition, getting the city to pledge to actually house people, because at first that wasn't clear that they were even going to do that, that they were even committed to that. And then, you know, we had to pass a little legislation, and, you know, but at any rate, it's still not looking good. The numbers are really low in terms of who they've actually housed, particularly in permanent supportive housing. If you look at even how many people have been assessed through coordinated entry, there's still a lot of people left behind even there. So it means that we don't even know, you know, what we don't know yet. And then, despite the city saying that they're not going to place anybody back on the streets or in shelter, anybody who came in before November, that is, that there's sort of tricky ways that they kind of are, you know, potentially doing that without people really, without it being that visible. And so one of the biggest ways is that they're offering some people what's called problem solving, or they call it diversion. And by diversion, they mean diversion away from the homeless response system. And so they'll offer people things like cash assistance to move in somewhere, or a bus ticket to go live with their family, one-time funds. And that's not housing. That's not a place. It's certainly not permanent either. The other thing is rapid rehousing is one of the programs they offer to people, and that's also not something that is permanent in actuality. It could hopefully amount to that for the person, but and so because eventually the city, the department, I think, you know, realized, or at least there was an admission, I think, of their inability to really make this happen at the pace that it needed to. They just recently started kind of a whole new program focused solely on housing the residents that they took out of the department and put into the COVID command center, you know, doing like fancy footwork here, and brought in these, you know, new top guns to lead that effort. And So there's the promise of maybe it getting a little better and having meaningful housing solutions, happen for people in a realistic amount of time. But we still haven't, if you look at the numbers, we're still not seeing it. It's and then the anecdotes don't really support it much either. There is a dashboard where you can look all this up. I'll try and find it and put in the chat. But yeah, in terms of the anecdotes, the residents we talked to, they're mostly still in the hotels, are telling us these crazy stories about how like they don't know, where to get assessed. They've never been assessed. Nobody's told them about their housing options. They have no idea like what the pathway is, and so they're, in addition to the poor numbers, we're also just hearing poor stories too.
Great, thank you.
I-
Oh yeah, go ahead, Brian.
As far as tenants or residents not understanding what's being offered to them or what is going to be offered to them, that is a problem that really needs to be addressed, because there are a lot of residents that have no clue as to what's going to happen. And there are a few people who have gone to the webinars or have gotten information however we had to. Sometimes it was like pulling teeth to get the information that I needed, but I think it's very important that somebody needs to find a way to notify the people who are in this hotel of what's coming up in the next couple of months, and importantly, very importantly, letting them know that if they want to be included in the number of units that are going to be offered, if they want to be included, that they need to stay in this hotel until they find rehousing, because when they move out of the hotel, that cancels the whole arrangement. They're out of the November 15th thing. So it's important that they understand not to. I was just talking to somebody 2 days ago, and he was again talking to somebody about trying to move into to somewhere off-site, like not here, and he was going to pay rent. And I said, what are you doing? Like you want to stay here so you can get permanent supportive housing, because from what he had said, he was already on the list. So that locking the city into all of the residents by, accepting the city's commitment to house all of the residents of the SIP hotels is it's a substantial thing. But if the residents don't know about it, there are a lot less people who will benefit from it.
It's a great, really thoughtful answer. Thank you so much. I feel like that segues really well into a question from Cody, who asked, given the relative cost of running the shelter-in-place style shelters, how would you think about whether we should continue using this model of shelter after the pandemic, as opposed to using those funds for other things like permanent supportive housing?
Yeah, I would love to take that one. So I think that first of all, I think that the costs are a little bit inflated, because I think that given that this is private housing with closed doors, they don't need to have as extensive of staffing as the way that they've staffed the SIP hotels. And I think part of that is they put in a lot of rules, and they have it, there's just like all the stuff, and then all the security and all of this. And so the feedback that I've gotten from a lot of folks that are in the SIP hotels is that they feel like it's overstaffed. That said, I think that there's, when we look at the shelter system, when we were first doing Prop C and thinking about, okay, how do we want to break up the money and stuff like that? At that point, we were pushing for about 1,000 more shelter beds, which is going to happen with the first allocation of Prop C, because that was the number of people on the wait list for shelter, and just kind of looking at, you want to like right size the shelter system, because you don't want to invest too much in shelter. Because what happens is if you put all your money in shelter, and then you don't have money preventing people from becoming homeless, and you don't have money investing in permanent housing to move people out of shelter, you just keep having to expand shelter because the shelter fills, there's no way out, and then new people become homeless, and et cetera, et cetera. And so you end up really warehousing people in a shelter system, and that's just plain bad homeless policy. I mean, we're trying to end homelessness, not have people live perpetually in shelter. So I think that that's a thing. That said, we do not have, for single adults, for example, a private shelter, a private room option for emergency shelter. So I do think on some of the hotels, and also like for families, for example, the families were in a really crappy church where there was no showers and there's just like one bathroom and you're sleeping on the floor on mats, and they got like 30 families crammed in there. Get in there at 3, and there's like, you know, you have to lug all your stuff with you every day, and then you're staying there all night except for like some smoke breaks. There's no space for the kids to play, and then babies are crying all night and you can't get any sleep. It's just not okay. It's not okay. And that's been our emergency shelter for families for a long, long time. So when the pandemic hit, similar to what happened with Hospitality House, Supervisor Dean Preston did a bunch of private fundraising and basically moved the families. And there was a women's shelter that was at a church in Western Addition as well, to a hotel. That's a really beautiful space that has like a center courtyard, and people have private rooms. You know, basically the couple who owns it charges like $50 a night, and they're really nice. And that's actually not a bad price for shelter. And so and we're spending way more than that for the other family shelters. So I think it's a good idea to have a little bit, you know, maybe one hotel that's a private room. There's maybe people who can't live in congregate setting that have accessibility needs, or et cetera, et cetera. And so we could have like some diversity in the shelter system, so that we have some private room setting. But in general, I would say much bigger bang to use that money for permanent housing and use that money to prevent people from becoming homeless. And then we've got a small shelter that people move through really quickly if we can't prevent their homelessness in the first place.
Great. Does anyone else want to address that? Or did Jenny sum it up? Okay. Moving on, Tim had a question about modular housing and public land. I know, Jenny, you were talking about the high cost of building housing as opposed to purchasing, you know, existing hotels and converting them into permanent supportive housing. Do you have any thoughts on modular units and whether that's a model? I don't think it's something that San Francisco has tried yet. Am I correct?
Yeah, we have one. We
Okay.
have our first modular housing that's actually for unhoused people that's being developed on Mission Street.
Okay.
And I don't know that it's panning out to be as inexpensive as people thought. There's a lot of trial and error at first. I think eventually it could be a good option. There is some struggle around the union perspective because especially the plumbers union would really like, because they'll lose jobs. They want to have a modular factory in San Francisco so that they can create jobs, which is a great idea. I mean, we've lost a lot of our light industrial and industrial jobs in San Francisco. So trying to have a modular factory in San Francisco, it's another way to create jobs and then be able to do the modular housing. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And Tim McCormick's pointed out that it's a lot of different things. You know, the old school modular housing is RVs, right? And you know, I mean, that's modular housing, and that's a great option for folks. And so, you know, having RV parks and, you know, I mean, it's all about like the bathrooms and the showers and again, the self-determination. But, you know, for a lot of people, they really, you know, that's how they'd like to do it. And it's an affordable housing, you know, so yeah, that's a point taken, Tim. There is a lot of a variety of different kinds of things. And I think that having a diversity of options is really key.
The RVs is an interesting one. Didn't the city have the idea of renting a ton of RVs at the beginning of the pandemic? What happened with that? Does anyone know?
And they're out at the piers. They actually have them on one of the piers, which was pretty expensive option because they have to bring in water and they have to bring in, it's run by an awesome organization Mother Brown's, otherwise known as United Council. That's going to continue, and the plan is to continue funding that. And so the state bought the RVs, but the like infrastructure and services and stuff are paid for by the city.
Great.
Cesar has a lot of awesome questions in there, so I want to just make sure we get to.
Yeah, are there any that you want to answer? I was just going through the list.
Well, I mean, I think part of what they're bringing up is this problem with the discrimination against drug use, et cetera. Some of it out on the streets that they're bringing up, but also some of the problems with inside programs. And I think this is a really important point that we need to do a lot of work on, and racism and lack of equity, et cetera. Even if we look at our supportive housing programs in San Francisco, we have a disproportionate impact on African Americans in terms of evictions. And so there's a lot of work being done through the Housing Rights Committee that's working with the providers to try to figure that out. There might be some possible changes to contract language that's being considered around forcing all the providers to go through a particular process. There's a lot of eviction practices in terms of hiring, high-paid attorneys that do evictions. I mean, there's a lot there, and a lot that needs to be done. And I think in terms of like and Cesar was pointing out about how traumatic homelessness is, and really, really getting the public to understand. I think that's really important to do, because I think that there's a lot of blaming of unhoused people and not really understanding what trauma looks like, what the impacts of homelessness has on people, and and how that kind of also what that means in terms of being trauma informed in terms of our response, why it's so problematic to have a cop respond to homelessness. We should not be having cops responding to homelessness. We have 65,000 calls a year. They're responding to trespassing. That's very trauma inducing, and also leads to injury and death, and criminalization, illegal searches. And so as Cesar's talking about the criminalization of drug use, that just feeds right into that. So I think those are really important points. And I also think we need to be thoughtful about how we structure our supportive housing. When we have an excessive amount of rules, when we, guest rule, and Cesar was bringing this up, if you're a sex worker, how are you going to bring your clients into your room if you have guest policies that prohibit you from doing that? That ends up being discriminatory towards sex workers. And so that's a lot of the stuff that needs to change. But a lot of very thought-inducing questions from Cesar. Thank you for that. And I know I'm not answering everything, but
no, I think that's really great. I think that the conversation around equity and who is being placed in housing, the coordinated entry process, as I understand it, does not take race into consideration, which is a very complicated thing. Whether it should or not is a very a nuanced issue. But yeah, I think that the question that came in there about how we educate people about how traumatic homelessness is, I'm just going to give props to Jenny and the Coalition on Homelessness, because I think one of the things that you do really well is inviting people to share their own stories, and really, literally handing the mic over to people experiencing homelessness to talk in a way that, to media and to politicians that they may not have had access to before. And so, I think if you are unhoused or marginally housed or in permanent supportive housing and you have things you want to share, definitely getting involved in organizations who are participating in press conferences and things like that. As a journalist, it's very helpful to hear those perspectives, and I will push them out into the world, whenever possible. So I think that's a really important point as well, to very much humanize this.
And just on that point really quickly, I do think that the humanization of this is an important point for getting policy to change, because we need as Jenny pointed out, like we got this push for the shelter in place hotels. And I do think in part because for one of the first times, the unhoused population had a very direct impact on the health of everybody. And so suddenly people cared. But I want people to care all the time. I want to humanize this all the time. I really believe that we have, and I'm talking about churches, like that's part of our work, is to reshift the narrative and to help people see a different way, because it's really easier for the media and for people to wash their hands of things when they can demonize it, or when they can say, oh, they're this, they're this, they're this, and to just, you know, put them in buckets of like, they don't deserve care, they don't do, and it's really easy to wash your hands of that. And so it really becomes a responsibility to start shifting the narrative in a really public, bold way, so that people can't, like, I mean, they can, but it makes it harder for them to dismiss other human beings if you're humanizing people instead of just being, oh, they're drug addicts, oh, they've got whatever, instead of just saying like, here's their story, here's who they are, here's what their background is, here are all these systems that our country, which is built on white supremacy, have put in place that have made it harder for other people to even exist in this world. And maybe you're complicit in that. And how can we bring that into the conversation so that we have a more holistic caring about this, and we're not living in our individualistic silos, which is how our country has operated for too long.
Yeah, Reverend, thank you so much for saying that. I think it is really important to kind of understand the systemic beliefs that so many of us carry about people experiencing homelessness, that, you know, they deserve it, or they messed up, or something happened that makes it so that they deserve to be on the streets. And once you start breaking that down, it really puts the impetus on us to treat each other more like human beings, and to push for policies that get everybody indoors. Francesca asked the question, are there any housing programs or services in SF that do take race and racism into consideration, prioritizing groups most affected by discriminatory displacement? I'm not sure that I know of any. I don't know if Sarah or Jenny or Reverend, you know of any?
I mean, I will just say that it's really tricky because of fair housing laws when it comes to the housing part of this anyway.
Yeah.
So there's not much providers can do. I remember there was even a situation where they were trying to open LGBT senior housing, and it was really, really tricky to do that, to have any kind of set aside that serves just one community. Otherwise, I think that there are a lot of groups that kind of targeting, you know, do it through and focus on in terms of being community based. And so they tend to, you know, reach out to and support specific, you know, communities. But, and again, that's not actual housing providers necessarily, but others might know more.
Yeah, there are like ways to try to maneuver it though. I mean, there's supposedly waivers you can get, like we got those for the women's housing. There's also like, I think, being really thoughtful about access instead of, you know, so we tried to, like, for example, for our city, our home, we were trying to get permanent housing for African-American community as they were disproportionately impacted by homelessness and racism. And basically, if a program in the Bayview is able to prioritize, if we're able to have them be the access point, and they're able to address that because 90% of their clients are African American, that might be a workaround. So I just think we need to get more creative with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will say it does seem like, based off of things I've heard from people experiencing homelessness, that there are some service providers and places in the city that are just more fluent in addressing issues of racism. And so even if it's not a policy on paper, there are places that definitely feel safer for some people than others. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. Let's see, anyone who could see the questions on my panel, is there anything standing out to you that you really want to answer? Or shall I pick something? We have so many good questions and another 5 minutes or so to go.
Yeah, I could respond to another Carlos question.
Go for it.
I had mentioned earlier about people moved in prior to November being guaranteed offers of housing. But this was a compromise in the legislation that I also referred to. Those who, because at first, as they were moving people out, the city was not placing people off the streets into these empty rooms. And so fortunately, the legislation got them to reverse that practice and start actually putting people in the empty rooms. But they said, however, don't think for a minute that this means we're obligated to provide you housing when you leave. And so there is this weird, segmentation where people have been there longer. We can hold them to that they need to be provided with offers of housing, but people who came after November will be put back into the streets or into shelters. So that's, an unfortunate, funky thing.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that we also have 2 sites that are closing. The Moscone shelter site is closing at the end of June, and the Safe Sleeping Village in the Haight camp on Stanion is closing June 15th. And they are not considered part of the CIPRI housing plan. They're not part of the pandemic prioritization. So a lot of the offers there, so for example, at Moscone, they're not even offering everybody there anything. And the ones that they are offering, they're basically offering a step down into a congregate shelter, whereas at Moscone, they have the little cubicles, so they have a little bit of privacy. So and then it, so similar situation in the Haight. And so I think one of the pushes is to say, look, you said you were going to do this pandemic prioritization because the SIP hotels were closing. Well, why not these other sites that are closing as well? Why aren't they included in this? And so we really need to push to make sure that, the folks that are at those sites have self-determination, and that they're exiting into something that is, at least a step up and not a step down,
Well, and I think it's important to remember that we are still in the middle of a pandemic. It has not ended. The CDC recommendations as far as who you're supposed to hang with and how often and where at are not that we should all just go sleep in the same room again together. So I also think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that we don't want to start going backwards in the progress that we have made, and to just close sites without a thought process or a consideration of the fact that the pandemic has not ended. It is still amongst us, and we need to that needs to continually be brought to light as well, that I understand these sites are closing, but there has to be a game plan to keep people safe.
Yeah, and one other thing that was brought up, and people in the SIP hotel, another issue that we've been facing is due process. So once you're in supportive housing, a lot of the questions were in the chat were around that too, like, what's the difference? A huge difference is that you have tenant rights when you're in permanent housing after you're there for 30 days. If you're in the SIP hotels, you don't even have the same rights as shelter residents do. So you can get kicked out on a whim. And stuff happens. One of the staff people hits on you and you say no, and then they kick you out of the hotel in the middle of the night. They can do that if they want. You don't really have any rights at all as a SIP hotel resident. So that's why due process is really important, and something that we really need to push going forward as well.
Great, thank you. So we're wrapping up to the end of our hour and a half. I feel like that just flew by. I hope, I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but I feel like we got a kind of good scope of some of the issues that are out there. And I think, there's been a lot of learnings over the past year, a lot of lessons that we have obtained, a lot of opportunities that are now in front of us. But there's a lot of work to do as well, as I think a lot of the questions have shown, in terms of equity, in terms of identifying housing, in terms of a diversity of housing stock, in terms of treating people who are unhoused with dignity. And so, I'm excited to have this team of people who are working so hard, and I really appreciate you all being here. Fernando, should I turn it over to you to wrap this up? We have 2 more minutes.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone. It makes me really proud to be part of this work and to be working with all of you in what you do. So thank you to Jennifer, to Sarah, Reverend Sadie, Ryan, and Nuala for leading us in this really, I think, very interesting conversation. We have a whole set of programs for the rest of the week. You can check them out at sfchoo.org/events. Tomorrow night, Thursday night, and Friday in the middle of the day. So I hope that you can join us, and thank you everybody for spending a really great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Take
having
care all.